North Korea has test-fired more long-range cruise missiles and short-range ballistic missiles. The tests form part of a record-breaking streak of launches this year. Pyongyang has conducted 6 weapons tests since the start of the year, including hypersonic missiles. This marks one of the most intense barrages in a calendar month on record. On Friday, the official Korean Central News Agency said the country conducted the test fire for updating long-range cruise missile systems. KCNA says the test on Tuesday involved long-range cruise missiles flying over the East Sea and hitting the target island 1,800 kilometers away. Thursday's launch then saw short-range ballistic missiles hit a target island. The flurry of sanctions-busting tests come after the country's leader, Kim Jong-un, reavowed his commitment to military modernization. Washington has imposed new sanctions in response, prompting Pyongyang to double down on weapons testing and hint last week that it could abandon a years-long self-imposed moratorium on nuclear and long-range tests. Right, to talk a little bit more about this, we're joined by Stephan Haggard. He is the Lawrence and Sallye Krause Professor of Korea-Pacific Studies at the School of Global Policy and Strategy and Distinguished Professor of Political Science, specializing in comparative politics at the University of California, San Diego. A very good evening to you. Thank you so much for speaking to us about this. I mean, I've just said a whole lot of technical terms, which, quite frankly, to the layman, I don't know what it means. Can you just unpack it for us? Just what does it really mean, all of this testing and the range of missiles that are being tested from a geopolitical standpoint? What is the significance of it?
Yeah, well, thanks very much for having me on. I always appreciate talking to my South African colleagues. No, the big message here is that cruise missiles can actually be steered in flight. And they can fly at low trajectories, and that means they're harder to defend against. So North Korea is just continuing to ramp up its capabilities. But I think underneath it is not only the quest for capabilities, but also an effort to get the attention of the Biden administration and try to get back to some form of talks that would result in sanctions relief for North Korea.
And what is the likelihood of that? I mean, it was projected as though he had a better relationship with former President Donald Trump. At some point, they were seen as buddies, so to speak, and even though there were some tensions, but it did seem like there was room to get through to each other. What kind of attention is he likely to receive from President Joe Biden if he does really turn his attention to Pyongyang?
Well, this is a great question, because, of course, Trump's effort to engage North Korea was only partly successful. There was this summit in Singapore, which looked like it was going to make progress, but then a second summit in Hanoi basically fell apart. And after that, the Trump administration gave up. The Biden administration has said that it's willing to talk to North Korea, not at the presidential level, but talk to North Korea if they're willing to do so. But so far, I think partly because of COVID, partly because of an internal turn in North Korea, there just doesn't seem to be an interest or willingness to go back to the table.
So if Pyongyang is ratcheting up the pressure because, as we mentioned, the number of tests are unprecedented, does it mean it can escalate? And because it's being accused of breaching the UN Security Council resolutions on this, what then should we expect from the UN as a course of action?
Well, of course, the action at the UN is completely blocked because China has decided that no further sanctions at this juncture are appropriate. And since they have veto power on the council is not likely to act. And in any case, all of these missile tests are in violation, but they don't cross over that threshold of an intercontinental test, which would really be a more significant issue. So I think the Biden administration is partly trying to play this down, But the big issue is going to be what happens after the Beijing Olympics, because North Korea is probably not going to want to rain on Beijing's parade. But after the Olympics are over, they could go to a longer run test, and then that would force a response from the U.S.
So what is the Biden administration expected to do by way of action itself? So it says it's recalibrated its position on North Korea, but I want to look back at 2017 and what those differences are, if there are material differences, particularly the fact that Kim Jong-un refers to the U.S. now as a hostile United States.
Yeah, well, the designation of the U.S. as hostile has been kind of constant. I mean, there was a little bit of unfreezing after the exchange of letters that led to the summit, and then during the summit era, when the South Koreans were also very much involved in trying to broker this new world. But I think the main thing the Biden administration has agreed to, which is kind of wonkish, diplomacy, but we're not going to get a big deal with North Korea like we did with Iran. This is going to be incremental. And the Biden administration has conceded that. So from the U.S. perspective, that's actually an important point. We're not going to shut everything down. We're going to have to accept interim limits. But even with those offers from the United States, those understandings, North Korea just doesn't seem interested in talking.
In South Korea and Japan, what do we expect from them? They're obviously concerned, as they said, about these latest tests, but what can they do?
Not much, actually, though I think this feeds into a longer-term discussion in Japan in particular. And what's odd is that South Korea has always been blanketed by North Korean missile capabilities. So in some ways, the public there is more blasé. But in Japan, this has become an increasing focus of attention over the last 5 years because they're in the sights of these cruise missile developments. And very slowly, I think a discussion is starting in Japan about developing the kind of capabilities that would be required to counter such missiles, which is a new development for the region.
I mean, we've mentioned where these missiles landed inland and outside on an island. What is the importance of this? And does that mean that South Korea is now rendered more vulnerable?
Well, I think South Koreans have been pursuing, and this is something people don't actually understand about Moon Jae-in. He seems like he's an engager. He's a center-left president. But he's actually taken a quite tough stance on defense modernization, and South Korean missile capabilities have continued to improve during this period as well. So there's a kind of arms race going on the Korean Peninsula at the same time that Moon Jae-in is desperately trying to get the U.S. and North Korea back into talks, including through this so-called end of war declaration, which has been an important South Korea initiative.
Just how far can Kim Jong-un push this modernization? What is the ultimate goal? I suppose if you're looking for sanctions relief and you're also flexing your muscles at the same time, it could have the opposite effect of what you're looking for.
So if I knew the answers to these questions, I'd probably be in the administration, frankly, and I'm not sure they know either. Because I listen to what I'm saying, and it's kind of somewhat contradictory. On the one hand, I'm saying that the Biden administration is offering something to the North Koreans that you'd think they would want, which is the prospect of sanctions relief. But on the other hand, the North Koreans are continuing to say that Biden is hostile and they're not willing to do anything. I think the larger backdrop of this is partly COVID. The North Koreans have been extraordinarily cautious with respect to COVID, even more so than the Chinese. The border remains almost completely closed. And as a result of that, I think there's just been very little opportunity for the regime in Pyongyang to consult, even with its allies, Russia and China, about possible next steps. Virtual is fine, but there's just virtually no diplomacy on the North Korean side either.
I'm just wondering, so Kim Jong-un has been working on this for the past decade, and yet, as we mentioned, he's pushing towards more sophisticated weaponry. Is there a goal? Is there a country that has this level of sophisticated weaponry that he would like to match, or that he would be competing with?
No, I mean, the only one that really is comparable, I would say, is Iran. But I mean, you know, there are only a couple of countries who have broken out. India, Pakistan are obviously outside the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Israel. But North Korea, you know, has broken out. It clearly has a nuclear capability now, and it's only a question of how efficiently it can deliver it. So I think the goals are sort of three. I mean, one is to just maintain a deterrent against the United States, because North Korea believes, I think wrongly, that they're under direct military threat from the United States, which is not the case. It's also increasingly an issue at home. Kim Jong-un parades these missiles and the nuclear developments as an accomplishment of the regime. And then finally, there could be some, you know, effort to get Biden back to the table by forcing his hand. I don't think that will tend to work, but that could be the way that Kim Jong-un sees the world.
Well, Stephen, thank you so much for speaking to us. Much appreciated. Stephan Haggard is the Lawrence and Sallye Krause Professor of Korea-Pacific Studies at the School of Global Policy and Strategy, Distinguished Professor of Political Science, Specialist in Comparative Politics at the University of California in San Diego.